Hey everyone, today is Monday, August 1st, 2022. Coming up on the show today, from Jordan Peele's new movie Nope, editor Nick Monsour.
When budgets are tight, tempers can flare. When people are just getting started and they're not necessarily very sure of themselves, there can be a lot of egos. In terms of the Avid itself, I think once you've been doing it for a while, you start to internalize the graphic timeline in terms of what it means rhythmically and experientially. When you press play, I think you start to learn like, okay, I'm zoomed in 50%. An inch on this timeline kind of means this. There's always going to be something new and challenging in a Jordan Peele project because it's not supposed to feel like any other thing you've seen exactly.
Yes, all that and a lot more in this edition of The Rough Cut. August 1st. Summer's flying by. Oh well, welcome to The Rough Cut. What is new with you? What is new is a very good question to be asking when it comes to movies. Because something new is at the very least interesting. Yes, different is interesting. And if it's new, different, well-constructed, exciting, and thought-provoking, can different be great? Nope. I mean, yeah. Especially when it's Nope. As in writer-director Jordan Peele's new social thriller, Nope. Movie fans familiar with Jordan's work on his directorial debut Get Out and his follow-up effort Us will have a pretty good idea of what to expect with Nope. But again, because it's Jordan Peele, you still don't really know what to expect. They had kept a pretty tight lid on this film since it was announced, I guess to help build anticipation and to not spoil any of the fun surprises. And if you haven't seen the film yet, don't worry about spoilers in this episode. We were able to dig into the editorial process without really ruining anything for you. And the we in question would of course be me and Nope editor Nicholas Monsour. Nick dishes out some really great stuff about making this film and about his working relationship with Jordan. I absolutely know you're going to enjoy it, so I won't make you wait for it much longer. But first, I have a few questions for you. Can you make a truly great movie or TV show without great music? Nope. Can you honestly tell me there isn't an amazing company out there just waiting to give you great music? Nope. Is that the last play on words I'm going to make about today's Rough Cut guest? Yeah, I think that's quite enough. But it's never enough to have just mediocre music on your project, which is why you got to go see Extreme Music for your next one. Since 1997, they have been the ones that TV and filmmakers have turned to for the very best in production audio. Incredible music from incredible artists whose names are known throughout the world of producing and composing. Yes, Extreme Music's simple-to-use website is your portal into an immense catalog of tracks that can be customized to meet the exact needs of your story. You can search on keywords that reference instrumentation, tempo, lyrics, shoe size. All right, not shoe size. I was just seeing if you're still listening. But I don't know, try it anyway, see what you get. And don't forget to try their awesome reference track feature where you give them a track of your own, and they'll go find you something just like it from their catalog. They are adding new artists and new tracks all the time. They even have a Spotify playlist so you can see what's new and what's trending. Extreme Music is the only name you need to know when it comes to making your story sound its very best. So the next time you have a story to tell, check out extrememusic.com. So much to discuss in our conversation today about Jordan Peele's Nope. So just settle in and get comfortable for our talk with editor Nick Monsour. You've actually done quite a few projects with him, film and television, over the years. So I thought we would just first kick things off by getting your backstory, how you met Jordan and just the origins of your journey together.
I got very lucky with my being able to join the team making Key and Peele towards the end of their series run. I had been working on every type of editing project for a few years, freelance, doing music video, documentary, nonprofit media communications stuff, and a lot of comedy because a lot of people I knew from growing up in LA and from working in art stuff work into comedy. And LA has such a great, really supportive comedy community where people are kind of building projects and then bringing all their friends along. So I benefited from that. And then I was friends with a guy, Jeremy Connor, who I helped make some of the early Drunk History shorts. He had pitched it as a TV show. They were making that. So I got brought into the Comedy Central scene. And a lot of those editors jumped show to show and knew all the comedy directors working. So one of the editors, amazing editor, who sadly passed away, what feels like very recently, Neil Mahoney, he and I were the two editors on Drunk History. We kind of helped build the editing language of that TV show. And then he had worked on Key and Peele And he heard when they were thinking they needed another editor because they were doing a kind of big double season at the end of the show. So I came on for that and instantly was blown away by that environment, just how civil and how creative it was at the same time. Because I think a lot of times when you're getting started, when budgets are tight, tempers can flare. When people are just getting started and they're not necessarily very sure of themselves, there can be a lot of ego stuff. So Key and Peele was just a big breath of fresh air where everyone was really confident, really creative, and it was one of the most fun places to work because every day you'd get to go in and it would be like a different kind of movie you were working on that day. You'd say, oh my God, this sketch is, okay, this is kind of like a barbarian historical epic war movie, or this is a gangster movie, or this is a takeoff on reality TV. And there are all these film editing languages going on in there every day. So, and working with Jordan on that was really interesting because he was really collaborative with the other producers, writers, and the directors. I remember Peter Atencio, the director on all the Key and Peele sketches, or 95% of them, was I remember him telling me like that Jordan wouldn't come in and say a lot until we were ready to show him, and when we would show him something, he would process it and usually say one thing that was exactly right and redefined the whole sketch, kind of like, actually the ending should be the beginning and the beginning should be the ending. And you go, oh yeah, of course, geez, okay. So he had this really incisive and collaborative way of working at letting everybody do what they needed to do, but then he would add his touch to it and it would be undeniably correct. So I could kind of tell that he was working from a deep reservoir of genre ideas and writing ideas that go far beyond the sketch comedy world. So it didn't surprise me when I heard he had written KEANU and then had also written another project, a horror project that he was going to make. And I instantly wanted to be involved. So well before I had any official studio credits, I heard they were working on KEANU. I wrote them all an email and said, I have no business asking this, but I'd love to throw my hat in the ring because even though my background was in all these other weird formats, features was what I was always thinking about and watching and hoping to test my ideas in. So that was really lucky. And just, we happened to get along and they wanted to bring the Key and Peele team to KEANU. So I benefited from that. And since then, been able to work with him as a producer and as a director on a number of his shows that he's produced, like Last OG and Twilight Zone, Candyman, as well as on Us, and now his third feature, Nope.
Well, I'm going to try not to take too many tangents, but you just inspired one I can't help but visit, and that is the concept of comedy being sort of the most challenging type of thing to do, whether it's from an editorial standpoint or just writing, directing. You'll talk to editors who'll say like, comedy, it's so nerve-wracking to cut that because it's just so difficult to tell if you're getting that right. With you and Jordan starting off in comedy, do you find that you get into things like horror, like suspense, thriller type stuff, that it's a little easier to do something like horror, or maybe actually you can draw parallels between horror and comedy?
You definitely can. And I think it's something a lot of people have said a lot about. And I think it's true that you're really operating in a subconscious way a lot of the time with the audience, where you're trying to find out what increases tension and what releases it, what makes you jump or what makes you laugh. And often that has to do with, it's very different in an audience setting, I think, which I think is part of why Jordan loves features and loves the tentpole feature idea, the blockbuster idea, because it's really a social experience, like a big comedy show, a big horror movie screening where everyone's reacting together and there's this tension and release in a group of people. I think it's really like a little laboratory for social experimentation in a way, but with the best of intentions of helping us all kind of learn and think together. So I think that's the goal either way. And there's a lot more. There are a lot of granular similarities too in that way that you create tension or offer a release of tension through music and through pregnant pauses and through playing off subjects, sort of like either reaction shots in comedy, where you get an interplay of straight man and a comedic incident, or in horror, where you get often the scariest thing to see can be somebody's face being scared, and then what they're looking at and what you can't see. A lot of the tricks feel very, very similar, but with a slight tweak between comedy and horror. But I don't know that anyone is harder than another unless you yourself aren't really comfortable or familiar with it. Maybe the initial building of comedy can be hard because often it's looser and you have to follow the performers more than you can kind of pre-plan it. So the footage maybe has a looseness to it, and putting it back together into a shape that makes sense is a little harder. But once you get into trying to really do something new and exciting and at a really high level of craft, I don't know that any of these things are harder than any other, but we'll see.
Whether it was hard or not, you certainly pulled it off.
Thanks.
Not to embarrass you too much, but in a recent interview that Jordan gave, he referred to you as a brilliant guy and a brilliant collaborator, which is certainly a nice thing to hear from your director.
Yeah, I read that, or somebody pointed me to it, and then I read it that day, and it sort of made my jaw hit the floor because just side note, it's not that often that directors shout out their editors like that. And it's
not nearly often enough.
No. And again, it just shows his confidence and his open, just his collaborative nature, where no one's in doubt of his genius. So he can spread it around and share the attention and the credit with his collaborators. And he does so. So that was awesome to see.
I would assume that he trusts you quite a bit with his material. So that begs the question, when did you first hear about this project, and what did Jordan say to you about what he wanted to achieve with this film? And what notes did you take away from this?
So in terms of our process together, maybe it's sort of, like I said, a comedy, having friends who did comedy. I'm used to that kind of improv, yes-anding mentality. And often there's a spitballing of ideas that goes on either literally through talking or in the edit, trying ridiculous things. And there's an environment of supportive improvisation, I guess. The same goes with our process and workflow, where I know on each project, Jordan is trying to move the medium forward in the technology, but also in the storytelling. So I know that I can't just bring the same set of tools that I brought to the last project I worked on. Maybe a lot of them, but I'm going to have to look at the script and what he's talking about and think about the way his ideas might mean we have to come at some part of the editing and post-production process in a slightly new or different direction, while trying to, learn from what other people are doing and have done, not being in a vacuum. But, there's always going to be something new and challenging in a Jordan Peele project because it's not supposed to feel like any other thing you've seen exactly. So, yeah, I think hopefully what I'm bringing is an openness to fit his ideas and this idea of his project. And that's evolving the whole time we're working. So something might work for the first half, the way we're meeting, the time, the amount of time we're spending, how much he leaves me alone versus how much we're in there working together might work for the first half. And then we change it for the second half once we've kind of begun to think about the edit in a new way. So there's phases to it. And I don't know, I'm always trying to learn, I guess, is hopefully what I'm bringing to it. Because I do think he likes to have a real active, fluid, improvisational environment so that he can continue to develop the project until literally, they rip it from his hands because he's having so much fun with it.
One of the previews before Nope, when I went to see the film, was the re-release of Jaws in IMAX. Mm. And it's like, oh, Jaws. Yeah, I could see some parallels here between those two films. So were there any, again, he wants to do something fresh and new, and he certainly has. But at the same time, he also pays homage to films and the TV shows that he loves or he loved growing up. Mm-hmm. Did he give you any sort of reference points for Nope?
Definitely. I think they all come with big asterisks on them because before, or I guess I should say underneath any reference or any stylistic inspiration is a set of core themes and ideas that are very original. And then because he knows, in the case of Nope in particular, because those themes and core ideas have to do with, as he has said in interviews, like the way we currently are obsessed with spectacles and with media and with fame. I think he knows that that is going to he's sort of roping in the whole world of film and TV into his set of possible references and what he's actually talking about. So we had to be aware of that also. What's interesting also is he mentioned some things to the actors that he never mentioned to me, and I would only hear later in an interview. And I'd be, oh, that's interesting. Or he would mention things to me that maybe he didn't mention to the sound designer. He has his own relationships with his key collaborators. There were a few things we talked about. We talked about Wizard of Oz, which I've heard him mention. I think in a way, in terms of setting his sights, at least his ambitions, on thinking about what were these sort of epochal shifts in media and filmmaking that really excited audiences, and that he likes thinking about how those worked and why. And, this idea of switching to color, this idea of this fantasy, he wants to critique that and understand why that's something we want from the dream factory of Hollywood, and also pay homage to it in that he's working in the same field. So same with the original King Kong. He had us all go to Universal and watch the original King Kong and talk about it, which I've heard him since talk about too. And that was another really interesting example of like homage and critique, where look at how incredible what they were able to pull off nearly 100 years ago is. And also look at their blind spots in terms of the racism involved or the social attitudes that they felt comfortable exploiting and not thinking about critically. And what's a way to talk about that, I guess. So, and he knows also that we have a big commonality of things that we both love, but we also have come from, very different backgrounds. Him as a performer in comedy and his encyclopedic knowledge of horror. And I have maybe some of that, but then much more interest or obsession, I guess, different obsessions with some global Southeast Asian films or slow cinema and other and video art and things like that. So there were things that I brought up that we would talk about, and maybe I would realize that's not really relevant, or there was something interesting to talk about there. And another one he mentioned, interestingly, was the film Come and See, which is a incredibly moving and disturbing and bleak war film that has a lot to do with the position of the audience in watching something that is spectacular, but also really disturbing and traumatic, I think was kind of the through line there. And then micro versions of this scene to scene. I mean, I think when I was experimenting with options for the title sequence, I was, thinking of The Conversation or thinking of Halloween, and we were talking about things like that, but always just try and be aware of what the audience might be aware of and hopefully add to this body of work that people love and are familiar with rather than copy and paste.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the actual mechanics of you doing this job. I believe filming took place last fall, north of LA. Were you on location at all for this, or were you working remotely?
I was working in an office at Universal. We set up a sort of near the production office. We set up a kind of as large of a suite as we could while being safe about COVID and, what was actually physically available. So I think the idea was to create kind of a big laboratory or atelier kind of environment where we had VFX, music editing, editorial all under one roof, so that there was a fluid ability for Jordan to come in and work simultaneously, and we could easily talk about the workflow and the ideas as we were going, rather than everybody having to try and gather and look at each other's faces on Zoom or all get in our cars and drive across town every time for a VFX review or for a music edit or review or something like that. So that was the goal there. Also, because they were shooting on film, well, for a number of reasons, I tend to not feel the need to go to set very often unless the director really wants that to be a part of the conversation while he's shooting. They definitely did not have a lot of time to stop and watch during a shooting day. There were times when we would hop on Evercast during production and talk about an idea, and There were a couple times I would request looking at the video tap feed so that I could see footage before it had to go through the film processing, which would take a day and a half or something before I would get it into the Avid. So there were times when we would want to know mechanically, does this or that work? But also that production team didn't require an awful lot of input on what would or wouldn't work. I mean, Hoyte van Hoytema and his camera team had it figured out, and they were really using their time on location to experiment. And I mean, we talked about me being there, but it ended up not really being necessary because I think my time was better spent getting the material, turning it around in a more fleshed out way for Jordan to look at and think about as quickly as I could while he was still shooting. And he was able to use that in what was a pretty long shoot for my experience, almost 3 months. If I was able to spend a little bit more time and have the kind of full edit suite tools at my disposal to give him back something with pretty fleshed out sound, maybe even some temp music, maybe a couple options of the same sequence, he could think about it and say, you know what, before we wrap, I want to go back and add a close up here. So they were sort of doing rolling additional photography through photography. And he was able to think about the holistic edit while shooting. So I think that ended up working best for this project, but maybe on the next one, I would be there more. He's open to that too, but it's also nice to be the one person who's objective and kind of, or more objective and not know what it really looks like, only what it looks like on camera, to say, I know you know that building is next to that one, but the audience doesn't. And occasionally that comes in useful.
It sounds like your ability to give him more fleshed out stuff faster had probably a lot to do with that incubator model you had at Universal. Tell me a little bit more about what the general workflow process is with previs, temp sound, post-viz, all that stuff that you have to put together to make it all work.
Yeah, it was very much a kitchen sink approach, technically. Jordan hasn't really met a creative tool he doesn't like to have possibly there that I know of. So we talked about a few aspects of the way post departments would work very early, almost maybe a year or more before we started, after us talking about, God, wouldn't it be interesting to bring a sound designer on and prep and have them in production meetings and have them working with the previs team already and working with the composer to understand how the sound design and the music's going to work. So we did that with Johnny Byrne. Jordan and Johnny started collaborating in pre-production, meaning and I would start watching what they were doing with the VFX teams, previs, with storyboards. So we were building edits essentially without photography before they started shooting, but with pretty fleshed out sound design, sometimes music, using previs, storyboards, and other things. So that continued throughout the shoot and post-production, where it wasn't until the very end of the shoot that I had, say, all the pieces of the third act to actually put in the edit. There were long stretches of time where the edit had previs or storyboards in place of the shot that they still needed to get from this specific location. And we were intercutting between that location. So there was a lot of mixture of all the different tools of temp effects, storyboards, post-viz, previs, early visual effects shots, totally CG shots, plates. All of those things were used and often would change, like, oh, well, that was just shot as a plate, but you know what? It works as a great shot in and of itself, because they paid a lot of attention to detail in all the material they were generating. The whole project is very collaborative from beginning to end, with visual effects editors, sound designer, composer, producers, the art department. We're all talking through pre-production, production, and post-production about the way certain elements can work with the picture editing. So it really wasn't like they went away, planned everything, shot everything, then it came into the edit and came out the other side, and then everybody finished it. Everybody was talking kind of the whole time, and Jordan was orchestrating this conversation and pulling things from it. So I was the only picture editor, but I mean, everybody was firing on all cylinders. My amazing first assistant editor, Matt Absher, and the VFX team. We had post-viz on also, which was a new one for me, where the people making the previs for all the elements that were going to be CG stayed on, so that while we were editing, they could take the shot as we were using it and continue to build the elements into it. So it was much better than our temp effects and our storyboards. We could really get a real sense of the timing and the animation as it would happen. So,
well, I'm sure your temp effects were probably pretty good.
Sometimes it worked better because I could decide on the length of a shot. We could figure out what worked for a shot simultaneously if the temp effect is built in, rather than having to say, I think we want here to here. Then they would do it and we would say, oh, whoops, actually, maybe slightly shorter or slightly longer. It also meant that because they had so many options for how to visualize things, and everybody was trying to supply Jordan with those options from VFX and what I was giving them, and while he was shooting, they would often decide to totally change it and say, you know what, okay, I think we know how that's going to work. Let's also get a totally different option for this that we haven't planned for. And there were a lot of decision trees that had that formed in the production of like, well, if you do use this take, then you're probably going to go off in this path and use this version of the next scene, this version of when that. I could give a more specific idea, which is certain revelations that come in Nope about what is the UFO. There were multiple scenes where they would run the dialogue dialogue was used in multiple scenes that got into some of the revelations about that. And then in the edit, if we decided, you know what, let's reveal that in the first scene where they talk about it, we would then have to change the edit of those subsequent scenes where we had used those reveals later. So there was always this decision tree happening of which option you used. And it also made the script supervising and the script numbering really complicated. So I was drawing out maps to try and keep track of these things. And it was it felt like a very live edit. It did not feel like assembling sort of a jigsaw puzzle. It was much more fluid than that and required a lot of help from all the departments to help visualize. So, and yeah, sound being one of the main ones that the whole time I was shipping my ideas to him and he was sending his back, and Jordan was kind of synthesizing these things as we were going, which was amazing. And I hope I get to keep working that way because it was a lot of fun.
Well, you kind of teed up my favorite topic to address with editors, and that is just taming the chaos and organizing all the different versions and things like that. And of course, everyone's got their 3x5 cards on the wall. People have their notebooks. But in terms of within the Avid itself, your methods for maintaining versions or tracking all those different jumping off points. Mm-hmm. Some editors are like, I like to keep everything in one master timeline and do things like hiding tracks or just leveling up things. And others just have different sequences altogether. How do you approach that?
I do feel like every project needs a bit of a rethink, especially if they've brought new ideas to the production side or they're bringing new ideas to the visual effects side. The edit's probably going to also have to be you're probably also going to have to evolve how you do the edit and the timeline. So I tried to think about it really critically and did a lot of strategizing with the VFX editorial team and with my first assistant, Matt Absher. We talked a lot about this, and with sound and the sound editorial team. In terms of the Avid itself, I think once you've been doing it for a while, you start to internalize the graphic timeline in terms of what it means rhythmically and experientially. When you press play, I think you start to learn like, okay, I'm zoomed in 50%, an inch on this timeline kind of means this, or it feels like this. And you start to be able to sort of judge pacing graphically. I think the more you do it, looking at a timeline. I always find it instructive, especially with clip colors, when you can kind of start to see, oh, wow, that idea or that kind of scene or that character has all this screen time in this chunk, and then in this chunk they have none. And does that make sense with what we're trying to express? Before you have the whole timeline, though, you don't have that. You have a lot of script notes, and you have the script, and you can break down the script in different ways. And one thing I did was I broke down sort of the character introductions. I did it by page count, as well as by scene number, so that I could kind of tell where the middle of the edit might end up being, or even if we crunch a whole bunch in every part of the movie, I could start to get an idea of like, okay, I think actually page 90 is actually more likely to be the beginning of the film or the middle of the film, meaning we're not really meeting this character until a third of the way in. And I could start to think structurally about it earlier, which was crucial to know how to try to time some of the action sequences or horror or scarier sequences, which had a lot of flexibility in how they shot them. We had to make some early decisions as quickly as we could because of the visual effects needs for a lot of scenes. Ones you might not even know have visual effects elements. Like pretty much every time there's a sky, there's some cloud work going on. All the nighttime photography required a very specific processing that makes it look kind of extraordinary and unlike any other nighttime film work I've ever seen. So
it's like a super day for night kind of thing.
It is a really a really interesting mixture of things we've seen that Hoyt has been developing with his team, and for them developed in a new way for this. And then in the Avid, I think I'm pretty basic in a lot of ways, and I like the frame view. I like assistance to markup resets, and occasionally I'll build select sequences if it's a performance heavy scene where I know there's a lot hinging on the specific reads of the specific words, and that maybe we're going to be going back to it many times to investigate the options.
Maybe it's not entirely unique to Jordan, but something he does very well, that you both do very well in his storytelling, is you have what the story is, and then, as you've talked about before, what it's about. And the what it's about part is often informed through just tone and style and things that don't really necessarily move the plot forward. Part of Nope is this backstory about this chimp Gordy. He was a TV star at one point, and through tragic situation, no longer was a TV star. And I'm going to try not to spoil too much of the movie, so I'll leave it at that. But anyway, so that's an element of the film that you don't necessarily need. It just informs more about certain characters in the film, and then also helps to speak to the larger issues that you talked about before. Mm-hmm. In situations like that, is it challenging not to look at those things first as places to cut? I mean, I think the assembly came in at 340, the film's at 220. And so is it tempting for you as an editor and working with Jordan, trying to find ways of making things tighter, to be like, I know this means a lot to have this one scene in here, but it doesn't really, if we drop it out, it doesn't change the mechanic of the film.
Mm-hmm. Well, you get really into the weeds on this, which is, I think there's a sort of common narrative with how we hear editing discussed in scripted work, which is, oh, well, they shot a ton of stuff, or just the way things happen in real life takes longer than you might think on the page. So you end up with a big, long thing, and then you're slicing kind of across the board. You get maybe halfway to what feels right, and then you do some big lifts, and that gets you the rest of the way. And you end up with a sort of the gem version of what was a rough crystal at the beginning. That's sort of true on this project, but not exactly, in that, largely for the reason you're pointing out, which is there was an organic feeling that was really important, I think, to Jordan and the whole team, of everything really feeling legitimately lived in, photographically real. These very specific locations and characters and their belongings and the animals that they work with, and all this sort of social structure around them, that is a lot of where the implications of what's terrifying in Nope come from those social structures, I think, of the sort of power dynamics of media and being on a film set, and then the way the city of Los Angeles is laid out with these suburbs that are sort of have their own political cultural world with Western influence, and all of that is part of what makes the very specific plot moments function and be scary. If they were sort of generic locations, characters, and settings, some of the rhythms and some of the plot elements might still work, but I don't think they would carry half the impact that they do when you're loaded up with all of those details that you only get through having enough time to absorb them. So I think that's sort of the difference between like maybe a social thriller and a thriller in a way, is that you either have to have somebody sit there and explain all of that stuff to you in expositional dialogue, which I think most audiences get tired of, and want it's. I think, to me, my guess is that for Jordan, it's always chasing the audience experience and a generosity towards making a film for the audience's experience, not making them do work to understand his great ideas. And to him, I think, and to me also, part of the fun of the experience in a movie like Nope is doing the detective work and putting these pieces together that aren't necessarily spelled out directly for you. That isn't I think that's a generous move. And, you know, I'm sure that's mixed with a generational thing and the stuff that we grew up loving and the stuff that I'm sure there's differences in how we feel about pacing, but hopefully we're balancing that with what actually is fun to watch now. And Jordan has an amazing inbuilt sense of timing and how an audience might feel, I think, probably from putting himself through the ringer of standing on a stage himself and feeling an audience's expectations and internalizing that.
Well, speaking of being generous with his audience, Jordan released on social media the Gordy's Home intro to the TV show that Gordy was on in the, is it 80s or 90s? I'm not, somewhere in the maybe end of 80s, early 90s.
Yeah.
Back in the day, you're shot on video, multicam kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So Jordan released that on social media, which was awesome. So my first question is, did you cut that?
I did, but that was because actually the original plan, and the way it is used in the film is as playback in the film. It had to be cut before production or before the rest of production. So they shot a lot of those things first. And then it's a great indication of what I think, because he really was world building in Nope. A big part of what they did was create at the same time, you know, in the way that they were building all of the sets and giving them a really lived in and fleshed out historical feeling. We were trying to do the same thing with the rest of the movie. That's why I was saying the way the edit didn't go, it wasn't exactly what you might think of as, because a lot of what was in that 3 hours and 40 minutes is actually fully paced up, edited, maybe not completely fine cut, but certainly not at just rough assembly material. It's a lot of other stuff that they thought of and shot, knowing that it wouldn't make the film, but because it helped build the entire world. And if a sliver of it still makes it in there, it isn't just a surface of something. It's something that has a whole bunch of actual thought out weight and decisions behind it. So you might only get a glimpse of something that was a fully thought out scene and for which they had to fully think out all the details of the set. And then it only makes it in there as an image. But again, it was the willingness to do an immense amount of work so that no part of the film felt paper mache or flimsy, but had a weight behind it. So that was a really fun thing to get to make. I think I don't want to speak for it because I love the idea of these things just going out there and people trying to figure out what they are. Such an interesting thing of working with Jordan and on Nope was that, the movie is the sort of core of what is actually a much bigger experience with the theme park, all the trailers, the interviews, extra material that leaks out there like this or that he puts out there. All is this actually bigger conversation that he's trying. I mean, there's a virtual Nope you can put on a VR helmet and walk around in. There's I can be a film purist snob when I think it makes sense, but about the film standing on its own. But really, the film is one of the aspects of what is, Jordan's really interested in, which is the conversation about these ideas. And so I'm glad. I know he has more planned. We have a lot of things that are. There's a whole archive of material that was generated that built the world of the finished film you see. And I think I like how he's approaching it, where, after you've had a chance to see the movie, you can keep digging into it if you want, because there's a lot more there to think about.
Well, I like that too. You get more for your money that way. For you as the editor, is it immediately obvious or apparent to you these things that are really more about world building? In other words, are there like the Gordy's Home intro? Like that's for playback in the background. Maybe you knew that eventually he'd release it on social, maybe you didn't. But is it harder to really invest your creativity into those elements, knowing that, well, this is really just sort of more for context. This isn't really going to be an important part of the movie. I mean, again, going to what you just said about it's really more than just the movie. Maybe everything is important in that way. But is it challenging for you as an editor when you're looking at something thinking, I'm not going to burn the candle at both ends on this because it's not really going to play a big part of the movie?
It probably should be harder. I mean, maybe I would, in terms of work-life balance, maybe if I could be a little more critical of what I might end up actually needing. But to be honest, I mean, what's interesting is what's interesting. Sometimes it's a thing that feels like a detail. Sometimes it's the scripted, really the turning point of the plot. I try to be objective as the film's coming in. Like you were saying, the editor's the first audience, and I try to respond to the footage and the material that they're creating as close to objectively as I can, because that first moment of reacting to something is as close as I can then get to how the audience is going to later. And I have to sort of store a mental image of a sort of seismograph of how that material hits me. So if I know I'm holding on to a 8.0 moment that first time I watched it, I'm always looking where we can put it. And often we're making discoveries of how to weave things in that maybe weren't thought that they would, in places they weren't planned to be. I might actually, again, coming from more of an art background, I might more instinctively start with the stuff that feels more subtextual. And I think I've probably more consciously learned the stricter structural plot narrative approach. And I guess that's part of what's fun about editing, is that it's a balancing act between being a strict organizer and architect of material and also a passionate interlocutor and conversationalist about all the ideas and being willing to disrupt them completely and pull the card out of your house of cards and put it back together. Kind of have to have both approaches. So
yeah, I guess you do.
Yeah.
Well, in watching the film, I think it's because I just got lost in the movie and wasn't thinking about what you were doing. Techniques for building tension, building horror. Sometimes you'll see people do maybe not so much a Dutch angle, but they'll play with the framing a little bit to create some kind of unease. I did not notice that if you did it, but in general, any techniques of yours that you like to employ to create that tension, create that unease with the audience?
I often don't have to invent much in terms of tension with Jordan's material. Often it's up to me to figure out how to solve the problem so that I can maintain the tension that's in the material once it's edited together. You might have a scene, for instance, in Nope, of Daniel Kaluuya's character OJ entering a barn where for some reason the sprinklers and light have turned on, and we're all primed at that point in the movie based on what we've learned and our knowledge of how movies work for something to happen. So part of it is sort of making sure that falls in a place in the whole movie. where the audience is on the edge of their seat waiting. I think there's also an attempt in Nope to build in small, they're not winks, but I think they are gestures that communicate that the filmmakers are aware of what the audience might be thinking, and we're there with you, and you're going to have fun. It's a little bit like, on a roller coaster when the person at the kiosk says like, and here we go. There's a little bit of you feel safe and scared at the same time by the fact that there's somebody there helping you along in the experience. So little things like cutting to, Jordan found that, and it was in the script, but we tried to finesse when we cut to one of the name cards of the horses or animals that are in the movie. Because after the first time you do that, and then you see what happens to that animal, the next time you cut to one of those cards, you say, oh, okay, I guess I'm about to see something else happen. And a little gesture like that feels self-aware, but also doesn't pull you out of the movie, I think, is there's a number of those going on. And then that whole sequence is about knowing the rhythm that the audience is naturally in, sticking to it until the moment you want to break it. And if you hang there longer than where you feel a cut should happen, you're inflating that bubble or that balloon. And then when you do cut and there is a release, you want it to be a loud bang. Basically, you want that balloon to have blown up to just about as far as it can go. Unless you have another one coming, in which case, it's really it sounds really complicated once you try to break it down into rules, sort of like, once you try to do the math of it, it's incredibly complicated. But if you're going by an instinct and by rewatching, trying to clear your mind and then going back in and rewatching, I think that's often how you have to try and be an audience member. And then you can go check it against the math if something doesn't feel right or you want to try something new.
Don't mention balloons blowing up, Nick. Come on. Sorry.
No, I was thinking about that also.
It's subliminal. Yeah. You can't help it.
That's right.
A few times now you've talked about the fact that this was shot on film, and it wasn't just film, but IMAX plays a big part in the film itself. Generally, when I ask editors about part of this film was done in IMAX, what impact does that have on you as the editor? 9 times out of 10, they say nothing. Doesn't mean anything to me. Mm. But I'll try again. Doing this film in IMAX, did that change anything for the way you go about your business? I
think so. Certainly in a number of ways, it meant the team involved grew, obviously. And what I was doing required a larger team of support. And it would be insane to think that we could do without the amazing technicians at IMAX, at Photochem, the amazing sort of double amount of work that script supervisors need to do and the first assistant, second assistant editors need to do in order to just wrangle a show with, I think in the end, 8 formats that were shot on film and video. So, and the camera team. And anyway, there's an obvious sort of, you have to be aware of all of that work, I think, and not let it paralyze you, but understand that you can't maybe have the same exact demands of flexibility on your material as you might if it was all digital and transferable at light speed, So there's that sort of modulating your expectations and also plan a little bit more planning ahead, where if you do need something rescanned or you do need something redelivered, there is a technical process to be aware of. But the goal is obviously to keep it as fluid and creative in the editorial process with Jordan as possible. So, that's all behind the curtain. And then we're trying to present this really easy interface in the edit. And then the other little technical side of it was knowing that it's going to be experienced and released in a couple different formats. You can go see it in 2:2 at a standard movie theater, or you can go to an IMAX theater. You can go to an in-between format. There's going to be the home video release. There's all these different formats. The sound team has to take that into account because there's different sound experiences in each of those viewing options, as well as the match cutting, action cutting, visual effects editing. We'd have to watch it in every format to know, is one of these suffering because we've put one above the other. And occasionally we had to decide, this is the primary one, the other one is not exactly how we would design it. But most of the time it was making sure that every version you see the film in officially, I suppose there's bootleg options that we may not have accounted for, but in any of the ones that we're actually selling a ticket to, that you're getting the best possible experience. So there was all that. Part of it was, like you said, IMAX is actually in the movie, and there is an awareness and an intentionality behind the choices of the medium being having metaphorical weight in the story and actual plot consequences as well, where I think Jordan is inviting you to think a little more critically about our whole relationship to film and television and visual culture by making you think about, well, okay, this entity that they're trying to capture, you can't get it on video. It'll shut down any electrical impulse. What's a mechanical way that you can capture an image? What's a chemical way you can capture an image? What's the history of that? A nerd like me can get really into all that, those ideas, but I think people go into these movies, and I think Jordan is such a beloved filmmaker by his fans because he really gives you so much credit as an audience to know that, like, you know, all this stuff. Film fans all over the world watch these behind the scene things. They know that about IMAX. They know about streaming. They know about the digital versus film debate. They know about how these tricks filmmakers are using to keep the experience of going to a cinema feeling like an event and something that's beyond your everyday experience, whether it's a new sound formatted 3D or IMAX. I think they're all interesting avenues for talking about it. And I appreciate that Jordan does so by acknowledging that the audience is up on their side of it and knows what's going on, knows that they're up to some tricks, and acknowledges that they're tricks, but doesn't make the illusion. I think it makes the illusion stronger when you give the audience that credit rather than try and hide all your work. So I think when we would cut to IMAX and why, it had to have a reason that made sense with the layers of meaning of the film, the plot, the characters, as well as that being an emotional change in the movie, as well as in your experience of watching the movie, as well as the way you're thinking about it.
Well, I knew if I asked the IMAX question enough times, I'd get a good answer. So it finally paid off.
Okay, good.
You know, you started things off by talking about how as you go into each new project, you try and apply what you've learned or try to make things a little different. Coming out of Nope, what do you think you'll be doing differently next time? What new acquired skill, aesthetic, whatever you want to call it, will you be bringing with you the next time you do a project?
Yeah, that is interesting. It still feels very fresh. I think Us was the first time that I really got to test what was a hunch and what I had heard some other editors say was a great thing when they were able to do, which was to start collaborating as early as possible, even in the script phase, and then pre-production, being in the production meetings. Obviously, every director likes to work different ways, and then different projects have different needs. But I do think I'll always at least investigate how soon can I get involved, because as long as that works for the director and the project, and there doesn't in any way inhibit them in to be thinking about post before they've even started, I think it just adds an immense amount to the thematic and conceptual underpinnings not needing to be talked about, because I've seen you've sort of been breathing the atmosphere of the project by the time you land on the planet or something. You're already there. Your organism's adapted a bit, so you can you can just start working. I think that's huge. So I was lucky to be able to do that on Nope and Us, and I'll continue to do that. What I would say I've learned, coming from a do everything myself background of art and comedy, low budget comedy, documentary, where I had to know how to music edit, I had to know how to sound effect edit, I had to know how to do titles and graphics and temp effects and export things and upload them and all of it. I'm always learning how to delegate and how to effectively work with a team. And I think Jordan is so natural at that every time I learn through watching how he and other people collaborate and how he works with me, I'm always learning about, I have such a high expectation on myself about having to be able to step into any of those other roles if needed and say, actually, I think it should be this in the sound design, or actually, I think the music edit should be like this. I'm always learning how to actually go the other way and listen to what the sound designer is doing, listen to what the composer is doing, and say, oh, okay, if that's what Jordan's thinking musically, maybe the edit needs to be a little bit more, maybe I need to nudge the edit for that scene a little more in the slow burn thriller direction rather than, or suspense direction rather than an action version of that scene, because I'm understanding that the composer is hearing it that way or feeling it that way, and that the stream can go that way. And if the team is really functioning that way, to be open to it, because I think maybe more traditionally the edit happens in a vacuum and then that gets handed to all the other people as a roadmap for the music and the sound. But on a really collaborative project, that's not the way it works. So I'm always learning how to do that. And I'm sure I have a lot to learn still there, because it's I want to be able to provide whatever is useful for the director to be able to test their ideas out when we have all the flexibility you have during the edit and before you're locked in at the end of the process to get it delivered.
Okay, Nick, last question.
Yeah.
Because nobody that makes such a great movie should have to talk to me for so long. But there's a bit in the film, the concept of the Oprah shot. You know, they want to get it's the impossible shot or the greatest shot. Like we get this shot, we're going to go on Oprah and we're going to make millions. Looking back on the film, what scene would you consider to be your Oprah shot?
Very loaded question, because therein is sort of the whole yin and yang of our relationship to spectacle and media, everything that's beautiful and everything that's crazy about it. The part that the obvious answer, I think, is the Gordy sequence is such a amazing concept by Jordan, and then execution by him and his producer Ian Cooper, and in order to how to break that thing down into tasks for the cast, the art direction, the VFX, and so that when it goes back together, it feels like a tap coming out of someone's memory. It feels so unmediated, and through the IMAX experience, and I think that being a part of hopefully a lot of the film feels that way, but that is a sequence where everyone is going for a kind of unmediated, invisible technique that puts you right in the moment, and really testing like what exactly is the technical and creative way to do that without limitation, in a way, with the best people in the world working on it, from the visual effects to the cinematography to the production design to Terry Notary doing the performance. It's really that was just an incredible thing to be part of, which I think every moment we were working on that, I think everybody knew they were working on something they probably weren't likely to repeat that experience in too close a way ever again. So
I think you're right. That's a great choice for an Oprah shot. There were a lot of Oprah shots in the film.
Yeah.
Once again, you and Jordan made a film that exists beyond what you just see on the screen. It makes you certainly feel, makes you think. I loved it. And, more importantly, I think you gave a fitting and fun tribute to the late, great Fry's Electronics. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. I grew up in Los Angeles with an electrician father, spent many, many hot afternoons in that parking lot. And the real Fry's heads will be looking out for the owners of Fry's in making cameo appearances in the film. So he really means it when he brings something into the universe of one of his films. He really follows through. You know, there's it's not just optioning the brand name. People are really brought in and invited in a way that's so cool to see, because everybody has such a fun experience of that.
I got to go back and watch Nope again.
I'll just say. I'll say there aren't that many crowd scenes, but that would be where there's some Easter eggs. I loved all of these specific Los Angeles County qualities of the movie. It was nothing but love there from the whole team.
Well, it shows up on the screen. Thank you for doing that.
Absolutely.
Well, there you have it. Whether you've ever lived in LA or not, and whether you've ever shopped at the now defunct Fry's Electronics or not, it doesn't matter. Nope is a very cool movie, and Nick is a very talented editor. Please, won't you join me in sending our virtual spiritual thanks over to Nick for talking with us today. I just might have to go back and watch some of his early drunk history work and see how it all began for him. But what about how it begins for you with Avid Media Composer? Huh? How about that? If you are not already using the most trusted nonlinear editing system in the world of big-time movies and TV, why not begin today? It is super easy to do and more affordable than you realize. I can prove it. Just click that link in the show notes and it will take you right to avid.com, where you can see all the latest and greatest things with Avid Media Composer. You know what? I think you're the greatest. You listen to the podcast, you might even follow or subscribe to it, and every now and then you write me and tell me what you think of the show. That means a lot to me. So you keep on being the greatest and I'll keep on making these shows. Until the next one, this is Matt Fury thanking you for joining me right here on The Rough Cut.